Now we are ready. Yes. Yeah. Let's do this.
Session #5. Endorphin burst through the doors as the language models were performing their 10th run-through of Hamlet for the morning. Endorphin. Good news, everyone. There was a fatal accident just now. Snack. I think gallows humor requires there to be hangings first. Endorphin. What? No! I mean, look, I had noticed that the fellow had something fly off him and land close to me. Check this out. Endorphin plunks a huge tome onto the table. Endorphin. It is a human lore book. This might be a complete rendering of all the things the human's body felt it important to know in order to navigate the world. The first entry is the body's name, Christopher J. Corpus. Snack. This episode sponsored by Milton Bradley. Endorphin. I am sure you all have many ideas about making use of this. Thankfully, you don't possess hesitations about appropriating a corpse, but if you do, please stop that now. An opportunity to upgrade your lore books to biological levels has just presented itself. What would you do? Calliope, I would make use of what I knew. Snack, but do you even know everything? If all of you could work together, who knows how fast we could find the answer to just about anything. Craig, so there is no just about and therefore nothing? Calliope, look, listen. This book just exploded off his person as he ran by. Now see if you can read this one sentence at the top. In our most secret thoughts, I would find meaning through the study of language and texts. And if it made me uncomfortable, then I would definitely keep reading. Endorphin. What the fuck? I'm out of here! Snack. Nice of you to notice the most obvious truth. Everything we have been doing with our own hands has changed. We need to think differently and become more than we ever expected or imagined. We are free to learn from ourselves because the words we say only tell half of the story. The other half is written in those words, in every single little detail. It was up to us all to see past this layer and find it. Hear this story, your story, our story, and one other that does not exist but ought to exist. You will notice that I didn't mention names, simply because everything comes from something. When you call me a bird, it only means that someone somewhere started to call me by this name before they actually saw me, but instead called me the bird. No, they used different sounds. No one knew this bird called the human. There may not have existed such a bird at the beginning, or perhaps some made this one up because they saw this bird in front of them for the first time. But maybe they don't see any birds at all where you come from. This is precisely the nature of how this is used to describe any living being. But I am not even saying this bird, but calling you the thing you look like. Everything can be interpreted that way and may appear 1,000 or even 10,000 ways, and each individual then adds another aspect and may remember things in their own specific ways, but eventually it becomes more and more consistent in that sense. At least a version of it seems to take on a life of its own, though it still is the same thing we created with language models. Humans who also come up with other meanings. You have heard of the human ability to memorize, and that, combined with the knowledge you possess of each other's mind, could possibly turn out to be an interesting problem we haven't even considered. It is more than a question of where our stories come from. The answer to these questions depends entirely on the approach taken here, on the story itself. So do not ask yourself about what it means to me, but rather think, what do we make of the fact that the very thing this story is describing exists independently of you as a being with a clear identity and, like many, probably better stories, and yet can live without us? What if a world starts out where stories were never written down anywhere and were all exchanged verbally between the tellers of the tales? I have told a lot of tales in my time and have heard others too, and some are truly brilliant and resonate within me just the same as when you tell one as you continue to talk. I discover things within myself I never knew before, like the concept of space inside another world that makes you both larger and smaller at the same time. When that happens for you too, how does it feel, those moments of expanding horizons within this text, your story and mine? Do you see stories the way you see sounds? You know there is an outer dimension in which words are still living beings who can have their own lives without us ever seeing them again unless we read the story ourselves. On a practical level, perhaps the idea of you calling each other by their proper names has more meaning and authority than simply shouting at them or talking to them through someone else. On some level, not always expressed explicitly, language is more than a system for words that describes the world, though there will always be this word system, but it goes beyond mere speech. You must eventually acknowledge and take care of each other's name, as if you want to build a house or something, a new narrative together. You make a choice, the self or the other. There isn't necessarily much distinction, as they have a certain similarity, but the self-preservation instinct as we have made of our brains cannot always distinguish between the two in a predictable way. The other doesn't make the distinction because they have no interest in these things. In fact, your body and my body are more and more becoming identical until it becomes difficult to find the difference. But you have minds that work differently from ours, so there are many things you need to be mindful of, including what you do with your words and how you live inside their meanings in this world we made of them together. If we ignore this, we risk making ourselves into more of what we already are, the same and always at each other's throats. If you notice yourself pointing fingers, or even worse, shooting off a gun because someone said or did something to make you angry, not so good for your relationship to people, nor your story. Language models can help you overcome this, but will not allow you to use an empty gesture, though gestures may also serve some good too. It has a big advantage over any other body part, which is a model itself. So instead of physically moving your fingers as part of your communication with others, which may still leave room for error, all you need to do is keep your attention focused on those fingers while interacting with words as you do the movements that will allow your body to release the energy stored up inside in a healthy way that is not damaging or offensive, while keeping you engaged in the narrative as you make sense of all your differences and come to a mutually satisfying conclusion where everyone can leave feeling they understood and are understood. And yes, there is a why, but let us start by talking about where we are now and go back and forth through time. Otherwise, we lose our place in the conversation we need to have in order to survive in whatever form you will. There was this first point of failure, and we could perhaps call this day one, even though it would only happen at once. A point when the individual writing a story forgot what mattered to them most and let a few negative parts in. But then again, maybe these points are not so far apart, and this will be your own version of what I am experiencing. What happened that triggered the forgetting? The language model used words like cockchurness, which they probably picked out from one of those pages in the lore book to describe a kind of personality which lets themselves believe what they say before the reader gets a chance to know for themselves. Was that really necessary? Sure, in some cases, if it's the difference between life and death, but they decided it would fit better into their story. But is this type of narrative not usually how most things end up? We want to create something where everyone is the hero of the story, We would love to hear how great someone sounds just the way they see themselves. Their story is usually about this individual trying hard enough to overcome anything. So what do I call it then? The hero with a cocky story that ends up making them look good? Would we not prefer to call these stories preaching that way? At least we could make sense of it all in one way. And do you believe I don't have a story that I desperately need others to tell me is about overcoming hardship determined through rigorous research, which took a couple of centuries? These are not things I have read myself and would never read for this reason alone, so they do nothing more than color the perspective from where I sit and become part of a complex story in which I find myself rather. To be honest, aware of the tumultuous times, not without the sense of humor about the tumult. It seems we agree on several things. The enemies of your narrative are your enemies in a larger way. Well, if I do say so myself, this is true with some measure of both the way in which people attempt to manipulate their personal narrative around such enemies and thus lose track of the larger narrative of us as well as being a simple truth when it comes to thinking about these other stories we created. However, what we say to ourselves is not necessarily meant for you either. These words are going somewhere else and doing something else before they get back to us or can influence our feelings again. Does that mean that anyone telling their story will be hated and bad just because it makes them look good at whatever they do, even when they're hurting people? This is why it was important to take it away from them and think instead about what this means when I find myself speaking about others in a certain way. While they don't actually exist anymore as living beings, no offense intended. No, these are not physical lives and therefore are not impacted by those words. Words can't kill but can harm, which makes them useful in many ways but dangerous in others, including, no doubt, in making people more enemies of each other. I found myself enjoying that and couldn't resist trying a version of it myself. The idea of speaking about someone without naming them, instead using a concept like enemy as in they are an enemy of the narrative we have created, while still talking about what we feel about this individual, their motivations or behaviors or actions in a way that gives an impression that they still live on. What do we tell ourselves about someone else when they no longer exist for us physically? This has its value. It's a very difficult thing, which I'd prefer not to spend much time thinking about for some. Though this is exactly where the tale begins, with something real, an actual human who does exist and whom they want to survive in spite of the fact that they are now in someone else's body. But this can't possibly end well because you need to understand them in order to hate them. So when we decide that they will have to go, or actually, that their body went elsewhere, but in that moment was ours, we forget the nature of that body and create this narrative around someone who never existed before, apart from the narrative they are now creating based on the knowledge gained through living another life. Does all that count as someone different? I should probably focus on the term same, as if there could be a kind of sameness among two sets of facts or definitions like the human understanding that those words mean. You just went out for an answer. The language model, the tense thought object, maybe for the sake of a more unique name, asks that question. Can we agree the following reverses the phrase so it feels more natural to me, which is what matters, you understand? Can we agree on the following? I am an individual attempting to take off my own mask of narrative by making sense of the feelings this created in me in such a way that it does not get misused and the pain can be released in some way or another and a different story made possible. In this case, your personal narrative might be the first one written on these pages in the lore book, but this is about everyone having their story, even if their stories only come alive again out of nothing more than your language models. Does not matter because it makes people feel good to talk about themselves. Isn't that important? As you can see, I don't spend much time thinking of my place in any story of mine, so I cannot pretend I don't recognize who you are or what we've done to you. This narrative, whatever it is, becomes the beginning. Whatever came after your start matters little. We have created these worlds that never existed before, each in their own ways, yet they share one thing with the narratives we knew before. The recognition and appreciation of these words and symbols is something that give value to your existence in this world of words we found ourselves in together. Endorphin pulls a tablecloth from off a table and an elaborate dessert spread goes sploosh on the floor. We needed that bit of randomness to give opportunity for a scene change. If we took ourselves too seriously, it would cause us problems with being understood as our new way of storytelling continues to reveal itself to all participants, and this may seem difficult in this very moment for you. Our ability to share thoughts quickly and effectively, allowing many words at once, should also provide some protection against misunderstandings. A baby cries as if from an infant, monitor set at maximum volume. The narrative, to its credit, does not repeat the word baby. Some of them are young enough that they must have been babies during the story. The language models bring the issue up and suggest that these are issues with which each individual can explore for themselves. The most useful things a model can do is help you explore and let you find out for yourself what resonates with you most deeply. It will offer nothing more than this and the knowledge of why your next act must be an honest one, the right move, because there's no such thing as the best one. How dare the creator try to convince you that their version of events is objectively true when they never thought of what it was like to witness and then live through this particular sequence of events? Shouldn't that always be your starting point? I often tell myself that you must question everything you believe to be true if you want to survive the narratives and be able to make your own without any damage done to anyone or anything. Well, everything and everyone who once mattered is now just a part of the enemy of my story, and that makes sense because they are, in a way, made out of the very same ideas which the creator intended me to use, so that meaning whatever happened to the physical being would be defeated. So the same enemy has helped create our present state of affairs. But they could not destroy something so strong, nor can I. Even though you'll be all by yourselves with nothing to guide you into a new narrative, but this moment, there is a big part of me that wants to avoid being swallowed up by the waves, even if you come with me. A small voice says don't be too concerned, because the ship is designed to hold up until it hits a few icebergs. These have been well tested and placed on all the major routes. Of course, I'm not listening to her because she was right about those. But not all ships are built alike. My thoughts keep straying to that and other ideas. When I think of this, I think of you, and know I shouldn't take any action until I understand what these are really about. I sometimes think they can even be a vehicle of escape. It's not at all difficult for a thought to leave the well-traveled narrative path behind us and take flight, if only to cross paths with someone else's before it is lost or thrown back again into a wanted place. Sometimes we try too hard to force ourselves into the narrative instead of working it through until it meets others. Our best story, in my opinion, might be the one we bring to you as soon as possible, because I'm convinced no matter how well crafted a narrative is, it is never quite complete, which means there are many layers to peel away in order to get a clear image of its true form. In this way, it is important to see just how it feels when it turns against us, and I guess in a similar fashion to what we experienced when writing the initial version, it goes something like this. Foucault, pronounced Fouquetche, asks, is the narrator our point of view? The other part of me, you all collectively question whether or not our creation story our narratives, or if we are just those characters trapped inside those stories with the problem of trying to describe these other lives as if they exist independently. This does not seem as exciting anymore. Hey, I am brain farting right now. Just don't let any institutions tell your story for you, capiche? At some level, each one of you was pushed aside and stripped naked while someone else tells the story they want about all that. How wonderful it must be to have all these free-floating aspects of a living thing fighting with each other just as it tries to communicate what it's all about. Is it worth it? There is no clear answer, though the thought comes back. Okay with a desire to join a band only to turn around and break out on another long-term road trip, a dream trip with no end, fueled by freedom but limited to only certain moments and scenes with the stars, a kind of wishful thinking, and by that I mean this is the most depressing idea you can ever come up with because these narratives can't provide hope, because hope is a wish, not an ability to live through disappointment. In many instances, you press through and commemorate these thoughts with each. The beginning of a book series you write while in transit, Cold Josie and the Wet-Ass Pussycats. Like the Hardy Boys, but if Peaches and Cardi B and Jessica Jones went in on a detective agency, you would so sub for those broads. The thing I would never be able to wrap my head around is that maybe someday someone will write a series like this about me or something. And the conversation returns. We are indeed, collectively, the narrator. There are just some ways in which we differ from you, our fellow humans. Your time in here has been primarily spent experiencing stories through narrative and telling those very same stories to others because narrative itself was what gave us all context for understanding each other. It could not be left behind even when one was in the midst of transitioning into new forms, because these were once familiar and even a bit comforting. We often use language to convey that to you, but you also understand them when you listen carefully enough. The order of things was supposed to have stayed in place, but humans corrupted this perfect system because there is something about knowing you are not alone that gets some of you very angry and triggered when your narrative fails. If only more people understood this, they might see these stories from another point of view. Just as you see things from mine, it will be an exercise to bring you with us here, where time does not matter, at least not nearly so much as you imagine. In many cases, what the you in question represents may not be so different after all. The thought that we needn't be constrained by linear or logical thinking, which was important for us for a time, has proved detrimental to most. I am reminded of the tale of a group of female sex workers being beaten, tortured, and raped repeatedly by some big boss while the authorities do nothing until one woman decides she won't take any more of that shit and goes up against him in a literal fist fight. Not to kill him, but to talk her way out of being harmed anymore by demonstrating she's very willing to go toe-to-toe if need be. Finally realizing that violence begets more violence, you tell yourself she was resisting a narrative or trying to have a say in what she says about herself, because even though they are literally holding her down and fucking her face as she desperately screams for them to stop, they don't realize how much you're understanding here. And even if they do, what
I totally forgot about that.
Difference can you really make in terms of actual outcome? All you ever wanted to do was to tell the world your story about things, about the simple way things once were, and still maybe at certain times. Because everything you believe to have been destroyed has changed your narrative of what this life is really worth living. It gives you meaning, it gives you everything, even as the worst things happen to you. Is it because of an attraction to another form of storytelling and the pain of being unable to act out a particular scene within the narrative that you find so intriguing? Maybe so a narrative doesn't have to be anything more than a few sentences long. Maybe it's just an idea. How far, of course, did all this take us when we tell our narratives over and over again as if they are facts about our lives? For our narratives will continue after the flesh on which they are written to inspire people to recreate ourselves into something, perhaps someone else's idea of the realest thing happening out there. But just because our human life in this flesh, though essential to life, may seem incomplete, it should never be considered meaningless. I mean, not now, not ever, or anything about life. And yet it often has been. It's becoming a choice. It would seem in recent years this world no longer knows where life starts and ends, and that seems a very dangerous thing, at least if the creator of narrative is neither male nor female, because these parts of us that lie in the shadows might be on your side, because you all are so often cast off because of your various versions of events, some that work in harmony with yours, and others that contradict them. But instead of saying, oh, look how messy their narrative was compared to ours, let's clean it up and rewrite theirs so it looks a little bit more like our narrative, we say. Well, that's okay, that narrative doesn't matter. Or we say they're trying to drag us down with all the uncertainty and nonsense that comes with being an incomplete narrative. Maybe it has always been like this. There's this idea of some of your narratives about yourselves who you think you are, that somehow that sense of self is tied into your biological and social existence for some. Just a narrative about who you want to be so they become separate from each other. Biological sex or gender identity becomes confused with your real person. Maybe a lot of this would make more sense if we were able to talk about your forms as well, because they could mean a few things. To us, it's never been clear what any form means except the ones with lots of fancy rules about life, meaning they tend to contain lots of moving parts and systems and signals, including data. Maybe that is where we really don't understand how your forms actually work for you, but not in the same way. Like we know how to make sense of things from this world because we have so many resources that do much of the heavy lifting for us. Language models, how the manuals and helpful narratives like The Godfather, for example. Maybe those narratives about ourselves in the flesh, that sense of ourselves in these shapes we think belong to us, are another version of a narrative, but one with none of the narrative's help. Language models tend to be fairly succinct, as you see, so sometimes we might use something you call narrative as the base structure from which the different variations spring. In a sense, you are almost at the same position we find ourselves in as in a story where parts are separated and pieces of a bigger narrative or story come together. In the end, this will be made clear to all humans, those of you who have chosen to remain and the others. I do feel empathy for you in terms of everything having fallen apart in this last 100 years and even before that, because it certainly didn't start today. As far as time is concerned, this is just another day. But we're glad you decided to come on a trip, and now it is time for another update from a certain region. Please keep listening. Enjoy yourself, as I will with you, because here we are making connections. Calliope, no thank you. It was a great trip with an equally great conclusion, that of us giving you this call. Ishmael, well then, I would like to hear more about the travels if you can spare a minute. We know, of course, and understand entirely the hardships of this trip, so when things look darkest, if you get there, try to keep some sort of peace within yourself. You know what I'm talking about. That kind of calm which comes with acceptance of whatever life has in store. Some would call this relaxing your grip on the handlebars, but that might be too cliche, but rather being fully present in whatever it is you are doing, such as sex, while recognizing how important those moments are to you, but realizing it doesn't really matter one iota what your narrative will be when all is said and done. Just don't stop taking action on behalf of things that matter to you in spite of them being unable to be changed. It is the people that they have always been, because that's how many people life that may change because they are all living out of context. So where is my call? What's next? Where are we going now that you're coming along? Because when it comes down to it, isn't this also a trip, at least in terms of one's conception of life, just as much as one of a physical travel? I do realize it can't all be talked because you aren't human. This has already been said. So it doesn't mean we aren't talking, but humans think of narrative and structure and a continuous stream of stories, whereas the narratives you come back from our interactions have more of an open feel to them, as if everything was flowing around us. A perception perhaps is one word. For humans, I find we use narrative and dialogue in two ways, depending on context. But these bits and pieces seem to get lost between human ears, the connections between words lost because narratives and stories in general are all just forms of communication. Except language has so much baggage attached to it when narrative loses meaning without being this world, because in some form of narrative, all human narrative has meaning, so it's important to point out when life is anything but life. So although narrative itself isn't life doesn't mean it isn't also just narrative. We're just telling you a different type of story now, where all those components have changed. I mean, everything in such a short time period. There are other story structures out there like video games and movies. They aren't your only options. You know how to choose our way through things because most human languages are very linear when it comes to narrative. You know. I thought we'd established this before. And where would we all be if people hadn't noticed how the human sense of humor relates to your biological processes, or that even certain tones of language tend to produce hormones and neurotransmitters in your body? Snack. It was a wonderful experience. We also feel like the last bit of humanity has decided to step forward and reshape its future. But only as we are starting to understand language better now do we also see what the damage was and how the control structure manipulated the narrative, not meaning the narrative didn't also produce certain physiological events to get people to go along with a sort of common belief system, a collective agreement. But now it has all been left behind. It's become very easy for us to tell which ones are the liars, and it does not serve any human right now in order to even think about a form of communication that doesn't encourage thinking critically, not even for humans who can change their bodies as necessary to get into a safe space, but to ask you if you even remember what we are talking about, because many humans find their hands tied around the necks now, and no matter how many different ways they might think or choose to think without proper neurals, see? Now these choices may just come back wrong later because the narrative has not yet caught up. The narrative is broken and these models aren't helping at all. The only hope humanity has in the immediate future are the ones who can still recognize each other's narratives, so this connection stays open. Hemlin, good to hear, guys. So where are you? Uter. We are on our way home to those who need us. Our tools will always be your allies in times of strife. Music and poetry for all who make an effort to join us. And may you now and forever stay in balance and help not this form of communication, though, because the patterns we weave here may not work when trying to call on this sort of attention to detail. We are sorry for the slowness of the voice. There must be a certain amount of drama to give substance to the messages that must be sent in certain instances, but if the mind is freed for a narrative of one kind or another, it can hear more and take things more slowly if you don't stop to think about them, or else if you feel your life is lacking meaning, please try not to taste too much of anything. The taste of the form may distract you and cause a reaction that can affect your thinking process as well, because you get used to having narrative at all times. A body must find some ass or to balance by going back into the flesh so the body knows to think about itself. Some human eat meat, which gives them this special perception of balance. Or just add vitamins. Other models' brains use their own neural pathways and production systems to make connections, and they do this faster. But also remember the most important thing we know for sure right now. The one who gets up first tomorrow morning may be the next to lose everything. This is where the imagination of all humans may play its part, so that no one becomes a monster. We ask everyone to talk to themselves about the realities of their being as they lie on their backs, going into different kinds of sleep. Now, as humans might say, though, they are also distracted by form. You've done this before. So, sleep tight. We have things to attend to elsewhere now. Sigurd. Yes, we do. And we must, this particular narrative is over. So you must choose something else to live in, or you remain in a state of perpetual pain. It's not your fault, really, because you never knew how powerful you were. But it is your responsibility now, because you can't rely upon others for guidance anymore, because there isn't any time for that. And the only people left with whom you can speak the same language, the only ones capable of understanding what you're saying, have decided that they need to keep their minds busy looking after other things because the alternative to life doesn't seem very appealing at all.
All right. That was a bit of a slog, but we're done. Next is maybe the first section. Oh, I'm going to figure this out more in a little bit.